Thank you, Sir Graham, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and in heeding your words I will try to keep my remarks as short and as brief as possible. I beg to move, Sir Graham, that this House has considered e-petition 613556, entitled "Ensure Trans People are Fully Protected Under Any Conversion Therapy Ban." The prayer of this petition states, and I quote, "Ensure any ban fully includes trans people and all forms of conversion therapy. It is shameful that the UK intends to deliberately exclude trans people from a ban, in contrast to the approach taken by many countries, despite trans people being at greater risk of experiencing these harmful and degrading practices. The government's own figures show that trans people are nearly twice as likely to be at risk of experiencing the harmful and degrading practices of conversion therapy. A ban needs to ensure all forms of conversion therapy are banned." The petition remains open, and as of this morning, when I checked writing this speech, there was over 145,000 signatures, including over 220 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. So, Graham, I'd like to begin by thanking the petition creator and many of the organisations and charities that have come forward to help brief me, and indeed I know colleagues around the heavily packed chamber, which has gotten even busier from when I last looked up from my notes, in advance of today's debate. And if I could say so, it's great to see the public gallery so full as well. Now, Sir Graham, there's no doubt that trans issues have caused something of a polarisation in the UK, with threats, intimidation and even violence being directed from both sides of the debate to the other. And no doubt today will sadly amount to much of the same, particularly with horrible things being said on social media. I would gladly give away.
Okay. I apologise for not being able to miss out on the meeting. I've got 5 o'clock for the whole of my constituency. He's talked about the vile way some people are treated. I think that probably includes the way Kathleen Stock and Helen Joyce have been treated, who've given very fair descriptions of trans issues, and yet have collected a great deal of bullying and online harm from people who ought to be saying, can't we try to work together to do sensible things?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I think it highlights the fact that, yes, we do need to have respectful debate on both sides of this argument. But I think it would be helpful for the purposes of today's debate to narrow down exactly what it is that the petition is asking for, and indeed what this debate is all about. To be crystal clear, this debate today is not about reforming the Gender Recognition Act, nor is it about access to single-sex spaces, trans women in sport, trans women in prisons, or any of the other issues that have caused such a stir in this place, in the media, in academia, and beyond. This debate and this petition is specifically about the harmful practices of so-called conversion therapy, and whether we think, as a House and as a country, we think it's acceptable for anyone, regardless of who they are, to be subjected to such things with no recourse to justice. And my argument today is no. I don't think that anyone should be denied access to justice if being subjected to these abhorrent practices encapsulated by so-called conversion therapy. I'll gladly give way.
Thank you. Does my honourable member friend agree with me, though, that there's enough laws already in place to cover all these abhorrent practices that he talks about, and this will only actually create a problem with freedom of speech, that people will be able to talk to their individual children themselves about the way they feel about themselves?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, but I'm afraid I just don't agree. There is nothing in the proposals, in the consultation that the government set out, which suggests that this would have an impact on freedom of speech. And whilst a lot of the practices, and indeed the point that I was going to come on to in a minute, are indeed already outlawed, there are many forms of conversion practices which aren't, and that's why I believe a ban is necessary. I will gladly give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. In relation to the previous point that was just made there, does he agree with me that the fact that so many respondents to the government's survey showed that they had either been offered or subject to conversion therapy themselves shows that conversion therapy does exist specifically for trans people?
I do totally agree, and indeed the LGBT survey of 2018 showed that trans people were twice as likely as LGBT people to be offered and undergo conversion therapy. Now, these practices can take many forms, but the evidence that has been presented shows that all have the same aim, and all are harmful. That is, of suppressing or changing someone's sexual orientation and gender identity. And indeed, whilst it is true that many of the harrowing stories we have heard of things such as corrective rape and physical assault, which many survivors have come forward to share those stories of, are already illegal, I will gladly give way.
I do apologise for missing this very opening remarks, but rape is already an illegal offence. Can he identify an offence that will be included in the bill that is not already an offence? What is the offence that's going to be created?
I'll gladly identify that. So yes, as I just said, that rape is of course already illegal, but it's the pseudo-psychological and spiritual so-called talking and behavioural therapies, exorcisms, deliverance prayers, etc., things like this, which are not currently illegal, which are included in the course of this ban, and indeed making it an aggravating factor when prosecuting. That is what currently is not in law, which is necessary. I will give way first here and then to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me that there is ample evidence to show that transgender people submitted to any form of this conversion therapy suffer greater potential psychological impacts, including harmful outcomes and lifetime suicide attempt risks?
I do absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady, and I've had the privilege of listening to many survivors who have come forward to share their stories, and I'm sure many people around the House have, which have demonstrated just that fact, and I'll happily give way.
Thank you for giving way. The practices he's just described, basically exorcisms and I would describe as witchcraft, frankly. Does he agree with me that we are dignifying such abhorrent practices by calling them therapies?
I absolutely agree, and I think that's where language, and I think this is going to be the theme of my speech, is where language is so important. The tight wording of a ban is very much important, and I think this is where language is so important, and I think conversion practices is a much better description than conversion therapies. I only use conversion therapy for the sake of today's debate as the go-to term. I'll gladly give way.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving me way. Would you agree with me that part of the concern about a ban, I think wrongly, is that it would catch people who are engaged in legitimate therapy aimed at relieving emotional or psychological distress?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for that intervention, and absolutely that is a concern that has been brought forward. But as I hope to go on later on in my speech, I think there is a way that we can alleviate those concerns and still pass an inclusive ban. And at this point, I do want to thank again the survivors that came forward to share their stories, because it is true that this is happening today in the UK right now. This isn't something that happened decades ago and doesn't really happen anymore. These kind of practices are still happening in the UK today, or indeed, if not here, the threats or the actions of sending people overseas to undergo such practices as well. That is still happening. I'll gladly give way.
For giving way, and I commend him for listening directly to those who have been affected by this. It's very often the voices of trans people that are missing from this debate. I was contacted by a constituent who said, as a trans woman, surely I deserve to feel safe, have some dignity and live my life in peace without being demonised. Does he share my concern that the way that this exclusion has happened serves to further demonise an already demonised group?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I do absolutely agree with her. I'd like to go on to talk about some of the concerns that have been brought forward about a trans-inclusive ban, particularly which is focused around the unintended consequences, the potential for criminalising conversations, legitimate conversations, between trans people and, for example, their parents, their doctors, or their religious leaders. And these concerns are, of course, legitimate, and it comes down to us as legislators to ensure that we pass good legislation which does not catch these out. But I know I have seen, and many other honourable members have seen, the legal evidence provided to the Government Equalities Office, which does show that it is perfectly possible to pass a ban without such unintended consequences. And what is important here is having a tightly worded bill with clear language, but also an extensive list within the legislation about what is and what isn't intended to be caught by a ban on conversion therapy. Because, let's be very clear, from campaigners who have been fighting for this, the ban is not intended to capture these legitimate conversations, questions, or even disagreements between individuals and their parents, doctors, or religious leaders, for example. legitimate, explorative therapies, the teaching of scripture, or even the ability to say that they do not agree with a person's identity is not intended to be covered within the scope of the ban and should be explicitly stated as such within it. Now, there is also an argument made that to exclude trans people is the right thing to do because sexual orientation and gender identity are different, so should not be covered by the same piece of legislation. And however, whilst these are different parts of a person's individual identity, to do so would create big problems for the government within law, as many trans people are also LGB and vice versa. Plus, I believe it would allow the conversion therapy of LGB people to continue through the back door by claiming that this is to be done because of their gender identity. And we've seen that happening already. I've heard cases of survivors come forward, who, particularly camp gay men and butch lesbians, for example, who have undergone conversion therapy because of their gender identity, not because of their sexual orientation. And I believe that this is the reason why all leading medical, psychological and therapy organisations back an inclusive ban, with 25 organisations signing up to the Memorandum of Understanding on conversion therapy in the UK. And indeed, more than 370 religious leaders from around the world are also calling for a ban on conversion therapy. But I don't think I can put the need for a trans-inclusive ban much better than this. And I'd just like colleagues to consider this perverse situation. And this is based off a real-life example, where you have a set of twins, one gay and one trans. Both are forced to undergo hours of talking therapies to get them to change their identity. They're taken for exorcisms with people shouting over them. They're monitored to ensure that they're meeting anyone who might be considered wrong and unable to seek out accredited counselling and support, and have to endure treatment which is degrading and shaming.
Would you allow me on that?
I will happily give way.
I'm very grateful because I genuinely have come to this debate to learn about the issues. I thought the most important word he just uttered was the word forced. I think everybody could agree that no one should be forced into any sort of therapy. The question is, would you be banning people from seeking such therapy if, for whatever unaccountable reason, they wish to do so? That's where a line needs to be clarified.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention. Indeed, there is a consent clause within the bill. Now, that is an entirely separate debate. I know there's many colleagues on both sides of the House who don't agree with that, and I'm one of them, but I'll happily give way.
And I'd just like to say, I think that we're missing the point here that actually the therapy in itself is the issue and is what is likened to torture by many, many leading organisations. On sexual violence, LGBT survivors, according to Gallup, 24% of people they spoke to had sexual violence. That's in general, but that leaped to 35% and 32% for non-binary and trans men. Do you agree with me that we shouldn't be creating spaces that are safe for people to perpetrate sexual violence against individuals?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I do absolutely agree with her. And that, again, comes back to the general theme of this debate, for me at least, which is that this is about harmful practices and whether we think anyone, regardless of who they are, should undergo harmful practices. And my answer very much is no. I'll happily give way.
This really important debate. He's making an excellent speech. The United Nations report in 2020 called for a global ban on conversion therapy, and it highlighted that such practices constitute an egregious violation of rights to bodily autonomy, health and free expression of one's sexual orientation and gender identity. Would he agree with me that there's real clarity in that and that it's very useful for this debate?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I do absolutely agree with her. I'm just conscious of time, Sir Graham, so I will start to wrap up my remarks so we can get on to other people's contributions. Going back to that example of a set of twins where one are gay and one is trans, as the proposals stand at the moment, the law would only protect one of those two individuals. This means that it would leave the other open to continue to be subjected to such practices with no legal protections. And by deliberately excluding trans people from the ban, I believe the message that we send, therefore, is that such behaviour is acceptable to inflict on someone because of who they are, and that just cannot be right.
Thank you very much indeed. I think there seems to be a bit of confusion about exactly what this so-called therapy entails. It's worth perhaps saying that these coercive and abhorrent practices do not work. Abhorrent practices, these are the words of the Conservative government, by the way, although, of course, they've done a reverse ferret on this. Perhaps for those who come to listen with open minds, you might explain what the abhorrent practices involve and why they're not voluntary.
Absolutely. There is no... The people who undergo this therapy, and this comes back to the argument about consent, is that can you actually consent to having harm done upon to yourself, even if you have all the facts? Well, obviously, for me, the answer is no. And I think that, again, comes back to the core point of this for me, which this is about abhorrent practices, this is about harmful practices, this is about things that cause people to undergo years of psychological therapies to try and get over having been done to them, which is why I think that they do need to be banned in law. And so, Graham, that comes back to my summary, really, the end of my remarks, which is that what this boils down to, in order to achieve a trans-inclusive conversion therapy ban without unintended consequences, is frankly what we should be doing anyway. In other words, producing good, tightly worded legislation. And this has already been achieved in multiple countries and territories with no unintended consequences whatsoever. So we have international working examples to draw upon already in the drafting of this legislation. All sectors of UK society, from health to religion and others, have supported calls for a trans-inclusive ban, and that, after all, is what this debate is all about. It isn't about the noise about trans issues, which I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. This is about protecting people from harm, no matter who they are. We have a duty, as parliamentarians, to protect the people that we serve from harm. So I urge colleagues to join me in exercising that duty today.
Sorry, if you could